When rejection happens once, a narcissistic woman can reinterpret it as misunderstanding or bad timing. But when rejection happens repeatedly, something far deeper is touched. This is no longer about attraction or disagreement. It becomes an existential rupture. Her sense of self is not anchored internally but reflected outward, constructed through admiration, validation, and the quiet assurance that she remains desirable and influential. Each rejection removes one of those mirrors, and without them, the image she relies on begins to fracture. Psychologically, this is where the danger lies. What is threatened is not a relationship, but identity itself. In Jungian terms, the persona she has carefully cultivated can no longer be sustained by external confirmation. The ego, deprived of reinforcement, experiences this not as loss but as annihilation. And when the ego feels annihilated, it does not seek truth, it seeks survival. Rational thought gives way to compensatory behavior, and emotional intensity replaces reflection. At this stage, her behavior often becomes confusing to the observer. You may notice sudden shifts, affection followed by contempt, vulnerability followed by accusation. These are not contradictions, they are defensive maneuvers. The psyche is scrambling to restore equilibrium, to reassert significance in any form available. Rejection, in her inner world, feels indistinguishable from being erased. This is why repeated refusal provokes such disproportionate responses. It exposes a void she cannot face directly. Rather than integrate the wound, she externalizes it, locating the cause in you. The moment you stop being a source of affirmation, you are unconsciously reclassified as a threat. Understanding this is crucial because it reveals a profound truth. You are not battling malice, but emptiness disguised as entitlement. And once you see that clearly, the power shifts. Rejection ceases to be an act of cruelty and becomes an act of psychological self-respect. The real question then is not why she reacts, but whether you will continue to surrender your reality to someone who cannot tolerate their own. Once seduction fails, the dynamic changes completely. What once appeared as warmth, charm, and emotional openness gives way to something colder and far more calculated. This is the moment where influence replaces intimacy. The narcissistic woman no longer seeks connection, she seeks control. Attraction was merely the entry point. When it stops working, strategy takes its place. From a psychological perspective, this shift is not impulsive. It is adaptive. The ego, threatened by repeated rejection, searches for another route to dominance. If admiration cannot be extracted willingly, it will be coerced emotionally. This is where subtle manipulation emerges: selective silence, sudden withdrawal, carefully placed guilt, and the quiet distortion of shared reality. Nothing overt enough to confront easily, yet powerful enough to destabilize your internal compass. Jung spoke of the shadow as the parts of the psyche we refuse to acknowledge. Here, that shadow comes forward. The charming persona recedes, and what remains is a compensatory mechanism designed to restore power. She may question your memory, your motives, even your morality, not to understand you, but to weaken your certainty. Confusion becomes the weapon. When you doubt yourself, she regains psychological leverage. What makes this phase particularly dangerous is its invisibility. There are no raised voices, no obvious threats. Instead, there is a slow erosion of boundaries. You begin explaining yourself, defending choices that never required justification. The conversation subtly shifts from mutual exchange to emotional trial, with you unknowingly placed in the role of the accused. This is not cruelty for its own sake. It is the ego's last structured defense against collapse. Control offers the illusion of safety where intimacy has failed, but recognizing this shift changes everything. The moment you stop engaging on her terms, the strategy loses its force. The essential insight is this: when affection turns into manipulation, the relationship has already ended in truth. What remains is a test, not of loyalty, but of self-respect. How you respond determines whether control survives, or whether it dissolves the instant you refuse to participate. When control begins to slip, the narcissistic psyche turns to something even more powerful than manipulation narrative. Reality itself becomes negotiable. Faced with rejection, she cannot accept the simple truth that you chose differently. That truth would imply limitation, and limitation is intolerable to a fragile ego. So the story must be rewritten, not to deceive others alone, but to protect her own self-concept from collapse. In this inner revision, roles are inverted. You are no longer someone exercising autonomy. You are recast as cruel, unstable, or morally flawed. This is not conscious lying in the way most people understand it. It is psychological necessity. Jung observed that when the ego cannot integrate an experience, it projects it. Here, the wound of rejection is expelled outward, attached to your character. By making you the problem, she preserves the illusion of superiority. What often surprises people is how convincing this rewritten narrative can appear. Confidence replaces accuracy. Emotion replaces evidence. She may speak with certainty, even righteousness, because doubt would reopen the original wound. Allies may be recruited, not for truth, but for validation. The more the story is repeated, the more solid it feels, especially to her. This tactic serves two functions at once. Externally, it protects her image. Internally, it shields her from confronting emptiness. But the cost is high. Reality fractures, and meaningful self-reflection becomes impossible. Anyone who challenges the narrative is experienced as an enemy rather than a mirror. For you, the danger lies in responding. The moment you try to correct the story, you accept its premise, that you must defend your reality against distortion. That is the trap. The narrative only has power if you argue within it. The deeper insight is this: you do not win by being understood, but by being grounded. When you refuse to participate in a story built to protect someone else's ego, you reclaim your own. And sometimes the most radical act of strength is letting false narratives collapse under the weight of your silence. When the rewritten narrative alone no longer restores control, a subtler and more effective role emerges: the victim. At this stage, she no longer needs to appear powerful. She needs to appear wounded. This shift is strategic, not spontaneous. By presenting herself as misunderstood, abandoned, or emotionally harmed, she appeals to one of the strongest forces in the human psyche, the instinct to repair, to soothe, to be seen as good. Psychologically, this works because empathy can bypass discernment. You may feel an urge to clarify, to explain, to reassure, especially if you are someone with a strong moral compass. The narcissistic woman senses this. Vulnerability, carefully displayed, becomes leverage. Jung understood that what appears as weakness can, in certain configurations of the psyche, become a means of domination. Here, suffering is not integrated, it is performed. This victimhood is rarely consistent. One moment she is fragile and hurt, the next she is accusing and indignant. These shifts are not contradictions, but tests. Each emotional response you offer is information. Each attempt to comfort or explain reopens the channel of influence. The goal is not reconciliation, it is re-engagement. What makes this phase particularly confusing is its moral framing. If you disengage, you may be made to feel cold or cruel. If you hold your boundaries, they may be portrayed as abandonment. This inversion places you in an impossible position where self-protection is framed as harm. The critical insight here is that genuine vulnerability seeks understanding, not control. When pain is used to override your boundaries, it is no longer an expression of truth, it is a tactic. Compassion does not require self-betrayal. The moment you recognize this, something shifts. You stop responding to emotional display and start responding to reality. And in doing so, you learn a vital lesson. Empathy is a strength only when it is guided by clarity. Without it, even kindness can become a chain. When all previous strategies fail, there is often one final attempt to reassert relevance, provocation. At this stage, the narcissistic woman is no longer seeking closeness, understanding, or even control in the conventional sense. She is seeking proof of existence. Any emotional reaction, anger, jealousy, confusion, even disgust, confirms that she still occupies space in your inner world. That, psychologically, is enough. From a Jungian perspective, this is the ego confronting the terror of non-being. Indifference is experienced not as neutrality, but as erasure. To be ignored is to vanish. So behavior may suddenly intensify. Words sharpen, actions become theatrical. She may flaunt new attachments, resurrect old grievances, or create conflict where none existed. These are not random outbursts, they are signals thrown into the void, hoping for an echo. What makes provocation effective is its emotional immediacy. You may feel compelled to respond, not because the claims are valid, but because they touch something raw. The psyche reacts before the intellect can intervene, and in that reaction she regains a foothold. The moment you explain, defend, or retaliate, the strategy succeeds. Attention, even negative attention, restores a sense of power. This is also where many people misunderstand the situation. They assume the intensity means unresolved feelings. In truth, it reflects unresolved emptiness. The content of the conflict matters far less than the fact that it exists. Drama becomes a substitute for connection. The discipline required here is profound. It is not passive silence, but conscious restraint. You must resist the instinct to correct distortions or justify your absence. This is not weakness. It is psychological maturity. The final insight is stark and liberating. What seeks to provoke you is not strength, but desperation. And the moment you stop reacting, you do not lose the battle. You reveal that it was never yours to fight. At the end of all these maneuvers lies a simple but uncomfortable truth. The final scheme only survives through your participation. Manipulation, narrative distortion, victimhood, and provocation all depend on engagement. They require your attention, your emotional energy, your willingness to explain yourself. When that supply is cut off, the entire structure collapses, not dramatically but decisively. From a psychological standpoint, this is where individuation begins. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole by reclaiming one's inner authority. Walking away completely is not avoidance, it is integration. You are no longer attempting to be understood by someone who cannot tolerate reality. You are choosing coherence over chaos. In doing so, you withdraw the projection and return responsibility to where it belongs. This absence is deeply unsettling to a narcissistic psyche. Without reaction, there is no mirror. Without a mirror, the persona loses coherence. What remains is the very emptiness she has spent a lifetime outrunning. But this confrontation is not yours to manage. Your task is not to rescue, correct, or punish. It is to disengage cleanly and without drama. Many people fear that silence is cruel or that distance is an act of hostility. In truth, clarity is neither kind nor unkind. It is honest. Boundaries are not weapons, they are definitions. When you stop participating, you are not depriving her of something she is entitled to. You are simply reclaiming what was never meant to be surrendered, your psychological sovereignty. This is why no final message, explanation, or confrontation is required. Closure is not something you receive, it is something you enact. The power you are trying to recover was never held by her, it was delayed within you. The enduring insight is this: freedom does not arrive through winning the argument, but through ending the game. And the moment you choose your inner stability over emotional engagement, the scheme ends, not with noise, but with your quiet, irreversible clarity.